Matthew 9, verse 14. And again, my sincere apologies to everybody. I sometimes have a tendency to lose track of time. All right. So here we've got a series of events that occur. And again, the events are set off by Jesus' interactions with the Pharisees. Now, I can't emphasize this enough with the Pharisees. And I'm going to point this out again because I know I've pointed it out a couple of times. But in contemporary writings about the Pharisees, they are universally thought well of. Contemporary Jewish writing from the time has a very high opinion of the Pharisees and what they're doing. And it is important to understand that one of the things that the Pharisees were doing is they had appointed themselves protectors of all that is Jewish. They felt, and don't understand this, there were severe attacks being made against the religion of Judaism, their culture, and their nation. They were under Roman occupation. The Romans had set up a parallel priesthood. There were two priests serving at this particular time. One of the priests was corrupt. Contemporary writing and what we see in Scripture suggests to us that the man was corrupt. But he was at least under the Old Testament law. The Romans had set up a separate system, and that guy was not Roman. He was a Roman puppet. That's all he was. You also had Herod. Now, not the Herod that you see when Jesus is born, but it is one of his relatives. And this particular Herod is not quite as bad as his relative was. But it is one of the Herods. They are not Jewish, but they pretend to it. Now, when you're talking about the temple at this time, the temple had been built by the Herods. Actually, after the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, have anybody ever seen pictures of the weeping wall in Jerusalem? There might be even some people that have maybe even been there before. I know that some people travel. That is the last remnants of what was left over of that temple. But here's something of interest to note. That's probably not even Solomon's temple. There was probably nothing left of that. Possibly. So the threats against the identity of being Jewish, the religion of Jewish, the nation of Judaism, the culture of Judaism was under severe pressure. The Pharisees arose out of a series of wars trying to maintain the culture. So don't misunderstand what the Pharisees are about. Jesus' attacks on them, however, expose something about them. And if you read in the Scriptures really bring this out. What is the main focus of the Pharisees? They're mainly focused on outward appearance. We get that great line of Jesus saying, you're like whitened sepulchres. You're white, your walls are beautiful white on the outside, but inside, what are you filled with? dead men's bones. I mean, that is such a vivid image. And here's the reality. There are still people like that today. And dare I say it, the vast majority of people like that tend to be, quote unquote, religious. They are concerned about an outward appearance. And that's what we have going on here at the beginning of verse 14 of chapter 9 here. Give me just 1 second to key up my notes. And I want you all to take into this part into strong consideration and think about it. Here's what happens. Right before this, Jesus has gone to a feast. He's eating. And he sees Matthew. Now, Matthew is one of the disciples. He becomes an apostle. But Matthew is a tax collector. Do you know who the tax collectors were? Does anybody in here like a tax collector? Oh, come on. Surely there must be someone that has a little love for the tax collector. I mean, not to get, well, does anybody here gladly, does anybody here send extra money to the IRS? Like, you can, by the way. Seriously, it's on the sheet. It actually says if you want to send extra. Is there anybody here that does that? Is there anybody here that, like, on the deductions, that you say, you know what, I'm not going to take that deduction. A legally allowed deduction, okay? Is there anybody here that says, you know what, I'm not going to take this legally allowed deduction that I had because I want to send the government more money? Really? No one? That's who Matthew was. He was a tax collector. Not only was he a tax collector, at least when we send taxes in, we're sending taxes to our own government, to people that we have elected, to people that supposedly have our best interest at heart. That's the theory, anyway, right? And they're using our tax money to build roads, to pay for hospitals, for the police, for the military to protect us, right? I mean, this is the theory. To pay their own salary. But they're people that are working for us. We've elected them. Matthew wasn't working for an elected government. Matthew was working for an occupying government. Matthew worked for the Romans, who were actively trying to undermine and to destroy and were directly conflicted, directly opposed to the Pharisees. The Romans were an occupying army, an occupying force that had no respect, no love, no regard for the Jewish people. Don't mistake it. The writings from the Roman writers, there's a guy called Juvenal. He's a poet from the Roman times. He made vicious fun of the Jews. You want to talk about anti-Semitism, you got it. This is who Matthew worked for. Not only that, do you know how Matthew would have made earned his salary? So the Romans said you've got to collect X amount of taxes. And then anything you get above that, that's yours. That's your salary. That's how you make your money. How corrupt do you think that system's going to be? If my incentive is to get as much as I can, any way that I can, am I going to be like, oh, you know what, I'm not going to charge you for that? And from all estates of the Bible, Matthew was wealthy. Now, how did he get his wealth? I don't know. But here's what I do know. He knew Jesus. I don't know how. The Bible doesn't tell me how. But all he walks up to is Matthew sitting there doing his job, and he says to Matthew, "Follow me." That's all he says. And what does Matthew do? Instantly. No discussion. There's no, I don't know. I mean, my intuition tells me Matthew must have known something about Jesus. He has to have. He has to have known who Jesus was. He has to have. But for whatever reason, Jesus says to him, "Follow me." And he arose and followed him. And it came to pass, as Jesus sat at meat in the house, behold, many publicans and sinners came and sat down with him and his disciples. The publicans, not republicans, but the publicans were the tax collectors of the day. These were the authorities and people that were Jewish, that were working for the Roman government. And they were not well liked. And then, of course, you have just apparently general sinners in general. At least as far as the Pharisees. And this is what the Pharisees says. "And when the Pharisees saw it, they said unto the disciples, Why eateth your master with publicans and sinners? And when Jesus heard that, he said unto them, They that be whole need not a physician, but they that are sick." And see, here's where we get into the whole aspect of it. The Pharisees are paying attention to the outward appearances. The Pharisees are looking out, and they're seeing people, and they're going, okay, well, now she's nicely dressed and obviously must be a very good person, so that's the person I'm going to associate with. Oh, JC over here, nice guy, got his nice tie going on here. You know, he's a respectable professor. He's my kind of guy. Now that Clyde Randolph, however, look at how disreputable he is dressed. No tie, got some sort of pin stuck in his thing there. He's probably wearing blue jeans and old shoes. Now, he is obviously a man lacking in integrity. Now, let me quickly say, Clyde, I love you to death, and you have served this congregation honorably for a long time. But I'm using you as an example. We're looking at that outward appearance. James warns us about that. Now, the Pharisees take it even further. They take it that, have you all ever heard the saying, no good Scotsman? Do you know what that logical fallacy is? So what happens is you say, well, no good Scotsman would ever pay money for that, would never pay more money than they have to. Okay, that's the stereotype. Scotsmen are very cheap. Well, then you take it, well, no good Scotsman would ever wear shoes like that. No good Scotsman would ever do X, Y, Z. See, I'm defining what a Scotsman is within the definition itself. And see, someone could be a Scotsman, Clyde or Bruce, could be a Scotsman who doesn't necessarily follow the exact same thing of how I think a Scotsman ought to be. But that's what the Pharisees did. The Pharisees said no good Jew would work for the enemy. Do you know who one of their least favorite, the least liked, the least read prophet of the Old Testament was? Does anybody know? They didn't like him. Daniel. You know why? Does anybody know why Daniel wasn't liked? Think about it. Who was Daniel? We say he was a prophet. Like he prophesied the coming church. He prophesied about the Messiah. He tells all of these amazing prophecies, which is instantly why they read the man. But what was he? Who did he work for? Well, okay. All right, fair enough. Yes, he worked for God. On earth, who did he work for? Well, the enemy. He worked for Nebuchadnezzar. And then he worked for Nebuchadnezzar's son, and then he worked for I've got my order out, but he like 3 successive nations of enemies of the Jews. Am I right, JC? I've got that right? Yeah. Was it 2 or 3? Yeah. Anyway, He worked for the enemy. And at one point, he was the third, and there's a whole interesting history about why it was the third, but he was the third most powerful man in Babylon. He was a collaborator. That's what he was. He was a collaborator. He was a collaborator that helped protect the Jews, maintained his own integrity in all situations, faced death on numerous occasions, and helped keep the Jewish people buoyed during their time of captivity. But as far as the Pharisees were concerned, he was a collaborator. And no good Jew would be a collaborator. I mean, I know everybody's looking at me like, oh, he wasn't a collaborator. Yes, he was a collaborator. He worked with the enemy. Did he hurt his own people? No. Did he stay true to God? Yes. He answered that question, who do I follow? Who must I be faithful to? Man or God? And his answer was always God. It didn't matter. But take it from the standpoint of someone looking up at him. He's a collaborator. That's what he is. And then the Jews of this day are following the Pharisees, and then the Pharisees ask this other question, and here's where we start getting into the meat. And here's the meat of it. They ask Jesus, or they ask his disciples, and notice at this point, it's always fascinating to me, they don't come to Jesus as much anymore. They're coming to his disciples. So here we go. Then came to him the disciples of John, saying, why do we and the Pharisees fast oft, but thy disciples fast not? Now here you've got the disciples, the remaining disciples of John the baptizer, John the immerser. Now John's dead. He's been executed at this point. Then the next part is we've got the Pharisees asking the question. The question they're asking is, why do the Pharisees fast off, but thy disciples fast not? Now, in our culture in general, we don't practice fasting, except unless we're trying to lose weight and fit into a dress or fit into that pair of pants. We use it in a practical way, whereas what we're talking about is fasting of a spiritual nature. So you do have some cultures that right now you've had Ramadan, which is a Muslim religious festival. And during Ramadan, there's a certain amount of time that you spend during the day and you do not eat. And then at the end of it, I think it's like at night, I think it's 6 or 7 o'clock at night, then you begin to eat, but you don't eat a whole lot. And there's a whole bunch around it. And then you also have cultures to where if you're about to make a major decision, like if you're about to start into a business decision, or you're trying to decide whether I'm going to go buy a house or not, you're going to fast. You're not going to eat anything. You're going to sit here and not eat, and the idea is it sharpens your focus. It sharpens the spiritual energy that you got going on, right? Well, you have fasting in the Old Testament. You don't really have that much mention of fasting in the New Testament, but it's there, it's present. Jesus fasted. He did it on several occasions. So there's nothing inherently better about fasting, but then there's nothing inherently bad about it either. Actually, if you feel bad enough and you're worried enough, you'll naturally fast anyway, won't you? I mean, if you feel worried about something, if you're concerned about something, like I don't have an appetite. And that's the first sign that really tells you, oh, I'm really worried about this because I'm so worried that I can't even eat. So we do that kind of naturally anyway. But that's not what the Pharisees were about. Now, I'm not going to speak to John's disciples because they seem to be earnest. But I know what the Pharisees were about. And the Pharisees were about outward appearance. And here's something to keep in mind and think about with this. And I want you to give this some consideration. This is from history. Mark 18:12 kind of gives us some insight into this. But the Pharisees regularly fasted twice weekly. They would do it on a Monday and a Thursday. And on other special occasions, and these could be a personal occasion like a birthday or some sort of personal decision that's going on or something important is happening in your personal life, and on national days. Fasting twice in the week was regarded by the Pharisees as a mark of superior piety and religious practice. The feast that we're talking about at Matthew's house, which was happening on a fast day, by the way, because this is, it's on a fast day, very naturally brought the matter up for consideration because it shocked the sensibility of the Pharisees. They're looking at what's going on. And then the question comes, can the children of the bride chamber mourn as long as the bridegroom is with them? But the days will come when the bridegroom will be taken from them, and then shall they fast. No man putteth a piece of new cloth upon an old garment, for that which is put in will fill it up and taketh from the garment, and rend it and make worse. Neither do men put new wine into old bottles, else the bottles break, and the wine runneth out, and the bottles perish. But they put new wine into new bottles, and both are preserved. Now, Jesus asked an important question, and to understand the rest of what's coming up, you've got to understand this part of it. When the bridegroom is present at the wedding, what's the natural inclination for you to do? You're celebrating, right? And often you're celebrating the beginning of a new life, the beginning of something new, a new part of a young man and a young woman's new life. Being married, well, everybody in here who's married, that changed everything, didn't it? It's just like everything changes. All the old norms, everything the way you used to be, has to change. You're no longer, as a young man, unmarried, as a bachelor, I'm a young man, I'm living for myself. I have few responsibilities. I mean, let's face it, young men, we could survive on very little, most of us, right? I mean, well, there you go. See, I didn't even know. And here's the trick. There really is a wrong way to load the dishwasher. I mean, it's not just but yeah, there's all these little things you didn't know. See, I myself, when we were married, when I was married, Christy will absolutely love to tell you this story. I didn't know you don't put Dawn dish soap in a dishwasher. Oh, yeah, you're like, yeah, I do that one. What are you? Just quick story. The kitchen fills up with suds. Just me, I'm thinking, you know what? I don't have any dish soap. That's Dawn. It's soap, right? It should work. And then, the next thing I know, the kitchen is flooding with suds. You literally have to take a shovel. I mean, you have to shovel it out and sweep. Ask Christy for the gory details. She'll gladly tell you that story. But once you're married, everything changes. What does it say in the New Testament, in the Old Testament, in Genesis? Two shall become one, right? One life, two people. Now, for women, I can't speak entirely for them, but, your life changes as well. You become a helpmeet. And this idea of, and this is important, submission. I had this conversation with a lady one time, and she was talking about she felt terrible. She just hated that word submission. And I was saying, well, okay, let's get correct here. When we use the word submission, what we're thinking about is, say, like WW, Worldwide Wrestling, or some of the wrestling where they grab somebody and they've got them down and they're holding them down and they're submit. They're forcing them into submission. You place someone in so much pain that they tap out. Well, that is a very particular word, and there actually is a Greek word for that. There is a Greek word for inducing that kind of pain to cause someone to submit to you. But when Paul is talking about wives being in submission to your husbands, that's not the word that's used. And more importantly, our example, men, is of course Jesus. We're told to be like Jesus in that regard. And Jesus said, I came not to be a ruler, but to be a servant. And Jesus ultimately, what did Jesus ultimately do for his bride? What? He gave his life. Well, there's our bar, men. Our bar is to be willing to give our lives for our wives. That's biblical. That's the command. We sacrifice everything for them. And we should do it gladly. And because we do that, if we do that, the submission follows naturally. It doesn't have to be forced, doesn't have to be done at the part of a chokehold. It's done naturally because that's the order of it. But everything changes and you have a new life, right? And that is something worth celebrating. Jesus points this out. He's saying, what do you do? Jesus describes himself here as a bridegroom, his disciples as the sons of the bride chamber. While he was present with them, there was no reason for sadness, there's no reason for fasting. And the time is coming. Now this is important. You'll see in the Bible where it often will say it's not meet, or it's not meet that they should go here, or it was meet that they should meet together. And it's not M-E-E-T. When I was younger, I thought it was meat, M-E-A-T, and I kept trying to figure out why they were eating meat at all these places. But the word is M-E-E-T. And when we use that, we mean that we're meeting someone, that we're coming to get to know somebody for the first time, or we're coming together. That's not what that word means there. The Greek there is a word that is referencing appropriate. It's correct. It is the appropriate, correct thing to do. It was appropriate for them to come together here. It was appropriate for them to meet together on the first day of the week. It was appropriate for them to do whatever it is that they're doing. So it was meet. Jesus is making this also. It is appropriate for my disciples to act in this way, for them to be celebrating. It is appropriate for them to be feasting. It is appropriate for them to have joy because I am with them. And then he says, there's going to be a time when it's going to be appropriate for this not to be the case. There's going to be a time when it's going to be appropriate for them to be sad. There's going to be a time when it's going to be appropriate for them to fast, because I'm not going to be present with them. Now, let me ask you this. What's appropriate for us? Is it appropriate for us to be fasting and sad and joyless, or is it appropriate for us to have joy and be feasting and celebrating? What's appropriate for us now? Oh, come on. Look at what he's describing. Is Jesus here with us now? Amen. He is, isn't he? What does the Bible say? Wherever two or more of you are gathered together in my name, there I am also. So, now, when I say feasting, don't misunderstand. I'm not talking about that we should be handing out cake and candy or bacon, which is what I'd prefer if I was going to feast. What do we have the opportunity to feast on today? The Word of God. And that's not a small thing. Why should we have joy today? Well, it does build us up, but from an even more personal standpoint, it does build us up. But we have hope. I mean, all right, the politics of it doesn't matter. But right now, the world that we live in, is there a lot of hope out there? There's not. People feel hopeless right now. And what they're doing in that life is they're looking for that opportunity. And we have that hope. And because we have hope, we have joy. What should we be celebrating today? Think about it. We are studying and having an opportunity to charge up, to have that knowledge. Alan a little later on, is going to deliver a message that is going to be biblical, solid, and if like most of his sermons, something that you can apply. I've not had a sermon of his where I don't have something that I can go out into the world and use it. Yes? And here's the thing. There is fasting in the Old Testament. It's under very specific and certain circumstances. But almost all of the fasting that the Pharisees were doing were man-made. They were man-designed, man-commanded, man-created. And like so many other things with the Pharisees and other religious people like this in general, they actually start from a fairly decent place. I mean, they're coming from a good place. They're taking what we naturally do and what we kind of know in our hearts, like we kind of know that fasting, there's something to it. Let's be honest. I mean, because I've had some points in my life where I have purposely chosen to fast, partly because I was so worried about something, it was going to be natural anyway. But they stuck and bound it in human ideas and human thought and human direction. And then they made it like it was God's law. And that's just not how it is. But Jesus is trying to bring home a point to them. There is a time when it is appropriate to feast and celebrate, and there is a time when it is appropriate to fast. There is a time when it is appropriate to be sorrowful and humble. It's always appropriate to be humble, but there's a time for it to be sorrowful and for you to have regret and to have sorrow. But then there's times that it's appropriate for you to be joyful and celebrating. See, Mom's funeral brought this home to me in a powerful way. Is that, like, I've had family members that have passed before, but I realized that I was very young. And youth experiences death very differently than you do when you're an adult. It's a very different experience. I don't know about you, but I started adding up the time from how, I'm 30 years. I got 30 more years before I'll reach the point that when Mom died. Will I make it to 80? Will I make it to 90? I mean, I don't know. You start thinking about these things. And then I realized that it is both appropriate for a person to be sorrowful because I've lost someone. I've lost someone that meant a lot to me. I've lost someone, and there's an emptiness that is not filled yet. And I don't know when it will, if ever. But it's real, and it hurts. And there are times that I will say stuff like, gosh, I want to call Mom and tell her. And then I have to stop because, of course, that's not something I can do now. But on the same part, it's appropriate for me to be joyful and to celebrate a life that my mother lived. I had no idea. I mean, I knew she touched a lot of people's lives. Oh, yes. Did you have something, sir? Yes, sir.
Time to be joyful was after you've counted all your many blessings that came down from God. That's the time to be joyful.
Yes, sir. And that's something I realized with my mother is just how much of a blessing she had been to me. And I knew she had done a lot for a lot of people. But I had no idea how many people's lives that she had been a blessing in. I had no idea. Now, so it's appropriate for me to be both sorrowful and joyful. And that's what Jesus is talking about here. He's talking about there's appropriate for all of this. And his main thrust of this is, Pharisees, you're not being appropriate. You're not being meet. You're not being correct. Now, we've got a choice here. I can leave you guys, but I made a promise to a young man over here that we're going to get into some stuff, but family happens. So what I want to do, we're going to go ahead and hold off for next week the latter part, the old cloth and the new cloth, the new wine and the old wineskins, because there's a lot there. And what they're discussing is what is appropriate and how things ought to be and why they ought to be that way. Here's a quick one. If you put a new patch on an old cloth, as that patch shrinks, it rips the cloth. If you put new wine into an old wineskin, as that new wine over time ferments, it expands, and what's it going to do to the old wineskin? It's going to burst it. So there's the first part of it, but next week we'll delve more deeply into that. Hey guys, again, I apologize. Next week will not be late, and we will discuss and finish up this next time. Thank you guys for your time and attention.